The archive chamber sat deep beneath the surface of Vulcar Prime, buried under 3 kilometers of stone and metal and silence. And Cephis had spent her entire life working in its cold blue glow, cataloging the remnants of dead civilizations that had risen and fallen long before the Galactic Conclave had learned to count the stars. She was Valkyrie, tall and thin with skin like polished obsidian and 4 eyes that could see in spectrums most species could not even imagine. And she had dedicated 200 years to the study of extinct peoples, learning their languages and their songs and their final desperate messages. And she had thought herself immune to surprise, but today her hands trembled as she worked. The data cache had arrived 3 cycles ago, from a survey ship exploring the dead zones at the galaxy's edge, a region where no intelligent life had existed for thousands of years. And the cache itself was unremarkable, a crystalline storage device no larger than her fist. Scorched and pitted by time and radiation, she had almost filed it away without examination, because they received hundreds of such artifacts every year, and most contained nothing but corrupted data and the fragmentary records of species too primitive to matter, but something had made her pause. Perhaps it was the strange symbols etched into the crystal surface, angular and aggressive in a way that felt somehow familiar. Or perhaps it was the way the device seemed to hum when she held it close, as if it still contained some spark of life after all these millennia. Whatever the reason, she had decided to attempt a full decryption. And after 3 cycles of work, she had finally broken through the ancient encoding protocols. What she found had made her forget to breathe. The species called themselves humans, and they had lived on a world called Earth in a solar system so far from conclave space that their light had not yet reached Vulcar Prime. And according to their records, they had achieved interstellar travel more than 3,000 years ago. This alone was remarkable because the Conclave had no records of humans at all. No mention of contact or trade or war. And a spacefaring species should have left some mark upon the galaxy's history. But as Cephis dug deeper into the FOS archive, she understood why the humans had been forgotten. They had been erased. The records showed a civilization of stunning ambition and terrible contradictions. A species that had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times before finally reaching the stars. Creatures of war and art and science and cruelty and kindness all wrapped together. In fragile bodies that lived barely a century, they had spread across their solar system in less than 200 years, building colonies on barren rocks and frozen moons, and even in the burning clouds of gas giants. And they had done this not through careful planning, but through sheer stubborn refusal to accept limits. And then they had built their first faster-than-light drive, and everything had changed. Cephis read the records with growing unease as the human story shifted from triumph to terror, as their explorers pushed deeper into the galaxy and began finding things that should not exist. Ancient ruins on worlds that had never known life, energy signatures that defied physics, and most disturbing of all, the remains of other civilizations, dozens of them, hundreds of them, all dead. The humans had been confused at first because the accepted wisdom in the conclave held that intelligent life was rare but resilient. That species which achieved spaceflight almost always survived to join the galactic community. And yet here were the bones of countless peoples who had reached for the stars and found only extinction. The humans had started asking questions that no one else had thought to ask. Why were all these civilizations dead, and who had killed them, and was the killer still out there? And then they found the answer. Cephas's breath caught as she read the first human accounts of contact with what they called the Silence. Entities so vast and so ancient that the humans could barely comprehend their existence. Beings that moved through the spaces between stars and fed upon the light of civilizations. The Silence did not conquer. They did not negotiate. They did not even seem to notice the difference between a human and a bacterium. They simply arrived and consumed and moved on, leaving nothing but dead worlds and cold stars in their wake. The humans had tried everything to stop them. They had built weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand the hearts of suns, and they had thrown everything they had against the silence, and it had not been enough. Nothing had been enough. The final entries in the archive were dated 300 years after first contact with the silence, and they painted a picture of a species that knew it was dying, that had watched world after world fall to an enemy they could not understand, let alone defeat. But what struck Cephas most was not the despair in those final messages. It was the defiance. Even as their civilization crumbled around them, the humans had not stopped fighting, had not stopped searching for some way to wound the things that were killing them. And their last transmissions were not pleas for mercy or laments for their lost future. They were warning. Cephas read the final message 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly, her 4 eyes wide with something between horror and awe. And then she saved the entire archive to her personal storage and began the long walk to the surface. She needed to speak to the High Council immediately, because the last human transmission contained coordinates and weapon signatures and a detailed analysis of the silence's behavior patterns. And it was addressed not to other humans, but to whoever might find it thousands of years later. The message was simple and clear, and it made Cephas's blood run cold at read. If you are reading this, then you have achieved the technologies that draw their attention, and they already know you exist. And they are coming for you just as they came for us and for all the others who came before. And you cannot stop them, but perhaps with what we have learned and what you will learn, you can hurt them, and perhaps someday someone will finally find a way to end them. But that someone will not be us, because we are already dead, and we have been dead for a very long time. And now you must decide what you will do with the time you have left. Cephas walked faster. The council needed to hear this now. The High Council chamber was a perfect sphere carved from living crystal, suspended at the heart of the conclave's capital station, and it had witnessed 12,000 years of decisions that shaped the fate of 100 billion souls across 10,000 worlds. Cephas had never stood in this chamber before. She had never expected to stand in this chamber at all, because she was a simple archivist, a keeper of dead languages and forgotten histories. And the council did not summon archivists unless something had gone terribly wrong. The 7 counselors floated in their gravity cradles, arranged in a circle around her, their forms representing the 7 founding species of the conclave. And their eyes watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to mild irritation. High Counselor Veth was a Marathi, massive and armored and ancient beyond measure. And when he spoke, his voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. He asked why she had requested this audience with such urgent. Cephas told them everything. She showed them the human archive and the records of the silence and the pattern she had discovered in the days since her first breakthrough, the terrible pattern that had kept her awake through 3 sleep cycles as she checked and rechecked her calculations. The council listened in silence as she explained how she had cross-referenced the human data with every extinct civilization in the conclave's archives, how she had found the same markers again and again, how every species that had achieved 3 specific technologies had vanished within 2 centuries of achieving them faster than light: communication, artificial general intelligence, antimatter synthesis. The conclave had achieved all 3 within the last 100 years. When she finished speaking, the chamber was quiet for a long moment, and then Counselor Veth made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a growl. He told her that she had done impressive work, but that she was seeing patterns where none existed. That the death of civilizations was simply the natural order of things. That species rose and fell for countless reasons, and there was no need to invent cosmic monsters to explain its cephas. Felt her heart sink, she tried to argue, but the other counselors were already nodding in agreement, already dismissing her findings as the overactive imagination of a researcher who had spent too long studying dead things. Counselor Meath of the Sari told her kindly but firmly that the silence was clearly a myth created by a doomed species, trying to make sense of its own extinction. That humans had probably destroyed themselves through war or disease or environmental collapse, just like so many others. Counselor Veth told her that her findings would be classified for now to prevent unnecessary panic among the general population, and that she would be reassigned to a less sensitive department where she could focus on more productive research. Shethys wanted to scream at them. She wanted to grab them and shake them and make them understand that they were all going to die if they did not listen. But she knew it would do no good because she had seen this pattern before in her studies. The way civilizations always believed they were special, always believed that the rules did not apply to them. She bowed her head and accepted the council's decision and walked out of the chamber with her legs trembling beneath her. That night she sat alone in her quarters and stared at the human archive and wondered if she was wrong, if perhaps the council was right and she had simply lost perspective after too many years surrounded by the ghosts of dead peoples. And then her personal communicator chimed with an alert from the long-range sensor network. She read the report 3 times before she believed that something had emerged from dark space at the edge of conclave territory, something that the sensors could not properly identify because it seemed to absorb every scanning frequency they directed at it. Something vast, something that moved with purpose toward the core worlds. Cephas pulled up the sensor data and compared it to the records in the human archive, and her blood turned to ice in her veins because the signatures matched perfectly. The same strange absorption patterns, the same impossible size, the same inexorable trajectory. The silence had found them. She tried to contact the council, but her access had already been revoked and her calls were blocked. And when she tried to leave her quarters, she found 2 security officers waiting outside her door. They told her politely but firmly that she was being held for her own protection until her reassignment could be processed. She spent the next 6 hours watching through her window as emergency alerts began flashing across the station, as military ships scrambled toward the edge of conclave space, as the official news channels first denied that anything was wrong and then admitted that there was a minor anomaly and then went silent altogether. By morning, the first reports of destroyed outposts were coming in. By midday, 3 colony worlds had gone dark. By evening, the conclave fleet had engaged the enemy and had been scattered like leaves in a storm, their most powerful weapons doing nothing, their shields lasting seconds against attacks they could not even see coming. Cephys watched the chaos unfold and felt a strange calm settle over her because she had known this was coming and she had tried to warn them, and now all she could do was figure out how to survive long enough to find another way. She waited until her guards were distracted by the emergency alerts, and then she slipped out of her quarters through a maintenance hatch that she had discovered during her first year on the station, a route that led down through forgotten corridors to the docking bays where small research vessels were stored. She found a ship and she took it, and she ran as she fled into the dark. Between stars, she carried the human archive with her because she believed that somewhere in those ancient records was the answer, the weapon, the hope that the humans had died to preserve. Behind her, the conclave burned, and The silence spread across the stars like a tide of darkness, swallowing everything in its path. The research vessel was called the Quiet Scholar, and it had been designed for long-range archaeological surveys, not for fleeing across a burning galaxy. But Cetus had managed to gather a small crew before she escaped, and together they had kept the ship running for 3 weeks as the conclave collapsed behind them. There were 7 of them in. Totalvarath was a Marathi engineer who had refused to believe the official explanations for the sensor anomalies and had stolen aboard just before Cetus launched, and his massive clawed hands could repair almost anything the ship threw at them. Cal and Sora were sorry, twins who had worked in the communications division and who had intercepted enough classified traffic to know that the situation was far worse than anyone was admitting, and their skill with electronics had kept the ship's sensors functioning, despite the strange interference that seemed to follow the silence wherever it went. Old Medic was a Velkari like Cetus, but much older, a retired military officer who had seen too many impossible things in his long life to dismiss anything as impossible, and he had appointed himself the ship's tactical advisor, even though there was nothing tactical about running away. The last 2 were human. Cetus had been as surprised as anyone when she discovered them hiding in the cargo bay 3 days after launch. A young man named Daniel and his sister Maya, who claimed to be descendants of a human colony ship that had escaped the destruction of Earth and had survived in hiding for 3,000 years. At first, Cetus had not believed them, because the humans were supposed to be extinct, but their genetic scans matched the records in the archive perfectly, and they knew things about human history that only a human could know. They told her that their ancestors had fled Earth during the final years of the war against the Silence, that they had traveled to the farthest edge of the galaxy and had hidden on a barren moon and had survived by never using any technology that might attract attention. For 3,000 years their people had lived in caves and darkness, passing down the old stories, waiting for either rescue or extinction. When they heard that the conclave had been attacked by the Silence, they knew their long hiding was over, and they had made their way to conclave space, hoping to find allies, hoping that maybe this time things would be different. Daniel was quiet and watchful with eyes that seemed much older than his face, and he spent most of his time studying the human archive alongside Cetus, searching for any detail that might help them understand what they were facing. Maya was fierce and restless, and she paced the corridors of the small ship like a caged animal, and Cetus could see in her the same stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had defined her ancestors. They were an unlikely crew, but they worked well together, united by desperation and the fading hope that they might find some way to fight back against the darkness that was swallowing the galaxy's ethos. Spent every waking hour studying the archive. The humans had been thorough in their documentation, and the records contained detailed accounts of every engagement with the Silence over 3 centuries of war, every weapon they had tried, every strategy they had employed, every failure that had cost them worlds and lives. She learned that the Silence were not a single entity, but a vast collective of beings that seemed to exist partially outside normal space, that they communicated through frequencies that drove organic minds toward madness, that their vessels were not constructed but grown from materials that did not exist in any periodic table. She learned that the humans had found only one thing that could hurt them. The Silence fed on certain types of energy, particularly the energy released by advanced technology, and they were drawn to civilizations that produced this energy like predators drawn to the scent of blood. But there was another type of energy that seemed to disrupt their feeding, a specific frequency that caused them pain, and the humans had spent their final century trying to weaponize this discovery. They had called it the Prometheus Protocol. Records showed that the humans had built prototype weapons based on this frequency and had tested them against silence vessels with limited success, damaging but not destroying the enemy, buying time but not victory. And then the records showed something that made Cephas stop reading and stare at the screen for a very long time. The humans had known from the beginning that they could not win. They had calculated the numbers and run the simulations, and they had understood that even with the Prometheus weapons, they did not have the resources or the time to build enough of them to turn the tide. They had fought anyway, but not to save themselves. The final sections of the archive revealed Project Prometheus in its true scope. A plan so audacious and so selfless that Cephas could barely comprehend it. The humans had used their last centuries not to save their own civilization, but to give future civilizations a chance, scattering caches of technology and knowledge across the galaxy, hiding them in places where the silence would not think to look, building a legacy of resistance that they knew they would never see completed. They had found fragments of similar caches left by civilizations that had died before them, and they had built upon that knowledge and added their own discoveries and hidden the results for whoever came next. Each fallen species had contributed a piece to the puzzle. The humans had added the final piece, the complete schematics for a weapon that could wound the silence badly enough to drive them away, to buy centuries of peace, to give the next civilization time to find an even better solution. Cephas looked at Daniel and Maya, and she understood now why their ancestors had survived. They had been entrusted with the location of the primary cache, the one that contained everything the humans had learned in 3 centuries of war. And they had guarded that secret for 3,000 years, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. That moment had come. Daniel met her eyes and nodded slowly, and Cephas saw on his face the weight of 30 centuries of waiting, the burden of carrying hope through an endless night. He told her where to find the cache, and Cephas set a new course into the dark. The cache was hidden in the heart of a dying star. The humans had chosen the location carefully because the radiation and gravitational distortions made it nearly impossible to scan, and because the silence seemed to avoid stellar bodies for reasons that no one fully understood. It took the quiet scholar 2 weeks to reach the system and another 3 days to navigate the treacherous approach, threading between solar flares and radiation storms that would have destroyed a lesser ship. But Varath was a genius with engines, and Cal and Sora were wizards with sensors, and somehow they made it through. The cache itself was a spherical station no larger than a small moon, constructed from materials that could withstand the heat and pressure of the star's outer atmosphere. And it had waited here in silence for 3,000 years. Daniel knew the access codes. His family had passed them down through 100 generations, memorizing the sequences and the protocols, keeping the knowledge alive even when they had forgotten what it was for. Station systems came online as they approached, ancient machines awakening from their long sleep. And Cephas felt tears streaming down her face as she watched lights flicker to life across the surface of the sphere. The humans had built this. They had built this knowing they would never see it used, knowing they would be dead for millennia before anyone found it. And they had built it anyway, because they believed that someday someone would need it. The station's databases contained everything. 3 centuries of research on the silence, detailed analyses of their behavior and their weaknesses, schematics for weapons and shields and sensors that the Conclave had never imagined. And at the heart of it all, the complete plans for the Prometheus weapon. Cephas studied the schematics with growing wonder and growing despair. The weapon was brilliant in its simplicity. a device that could generate the specific frequency that disrupted the silence's feeding, amplified to levels that could cause them genuine harm. But building it would require resources that the quiet scholar did not have. The weapon needed rare materials that could only be found on certain types of planets, manufacturing facilities that could work at the molecular level, and power sources that could generate enough energy to broadcast the frequency across light years. A single ship could not build this weapon, but a civilization could. Cephas gathered her crew and told them what she had found and what needed to be done, and she watched their faces as they understood the implications. The conclave was shattered, but not destroyed. Scattered across 1,000 worlds, there were still factories and shipyards and laboratories that had survived the initial onslaught. Still billions of people who were hiding and waiting and hoping for someone to tell them what to do if she could reach them. If she could share the schematics, if she could convince them to work together instead of fleeing in 1,000 different directions, they might be able to build enough weapons to drive the silence back. Old Medic pointed out that broadcasting the schematics would draw the attention of the silence directly to whoever possessed them. That Cephas would be painting a target on herself and on anyone who received her transmission. Cephas said she knew. Maya asked if there was any other way. Cephas said there was not. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and then he told them about the final transmission from Earth, the one that his ancestors had heard as they fled into the dark. The words that had sustained his people through 3,000 years of hiding. The humans who stayed behind the fight had known they were going to die. They had known that every ship they sent against the silence was a ship that would never return. That every world they defended was a world they would eventually lose. That every year they survived was borrowed time, but they had fought anyway. They had fought because every day they held out was another day for the colony ships to get farther away, another day for the caches to be hidden, another day for the knowledge to spread. They had not fought to win, they had fought to pass the torch. Cephas understood now what she had to do. She spent 3 days preparing the transmission, compiling the schematics and the research and the instructions into a package that could be understood by any species with the technology to receive it. And she included her own analysis of the silence's patterns and movements based on everything she had observed. She addressed the message to anyone who could hear it, to every surviving fragment of the conclave, to any other civilizations that might be listening from the dark corners of the galaxy. She told them what the humans had discovered and what they had built and what needed to be done. She told them that she did not expect to survive, that the silence would come for her as soon as she began broadcasting, that the knowledge would be out there, and that was all that mattered. She told them to build the weapons and to hide them and to wait and to strike when the time was right. Then she activated the transmission and sent it screaming across the stars. The response was almost immediate. Sensor alerts flooded the quiet scholars, displays as silence vessels changed course across the galaxy, abandoning their attacks on other targets, converging on the tiny research ship that had just announced its presence to the universe. Theseus watched them coming and felt no fear. She had done what she could, the rest was up to others. She ordered her crew to take the shuttle and flee while there was still time, to carry copies of the archive to safety, to keep the knowledge alive no matter what happened to her. They refused. Vareth said he had never run from a fight in his life, and he was too old to start now. Cal and Sora said they had nowhere else to go and nowhere they would rather be. Old Medic said he had always known he would die in battle, and this seemed as good a battle as any. Daniel and Maya said nothing at all, but they did not move toward the shuttle. And Cephas understood that they had been preparing for this moment their entire lives, that their ancestors had passed down not just knowledge but purpose, and they would not abandon that purpose now. So They stayed together as the darkness closed in around them, and they waited for the silence to arrive. The quiet scholar died in the shadow of a dying star, consumed by entities that had been ancient when the galaxy was young. And Cetus and her crew died with it, their names and their faces lost to the void, but their message survived across 1,000 scattered worlds. The survivors of the conclave received the transmission and studied the schematics, and understood for the first time what they were truly facing. The High Council was gone, destroyed in the first wave of attacks, and the military command structure had collapsed within days. But in the chaos, new leaders emerged, ordinary people who refused to accept extinction, who looked at the human research and saw not despair, but possibility. On a frozen moon at the edge of conclave space, a Moradi engineer named Korath read Cetus's message and wept, and then gathered every technician she could find and began building on a station hidden in the debris field of a shattered planet. A sorry scientist named Vel decoded the Prometheus schematics and realized that his facility had the equipment to construct the weapon's core components, and he worked for 3 days without sleep to begin production on 100 other worlds. 100 other survivors made the same choice, understanding that they could hide and die slowly or fight and die quickly, but that either way, the only thing that mattered was what they left behind. The silence continued their harvest, sweeping across the galaxy in waves of darkness, consuming worlds that had stood for millennia. But they moved more slowly now, because their prey was scattered and because something strange was happening. The survivors were not running, they were building it. Took 5 years of hiding and working and dying. 5 years of small victories and terrible losses. 5 years of passing the torch from one hand to the next as the silence hunted them across the stars. Korath died in the 3rd year when the silence found her moon. But before she died, she transmitted her completed components to 3 other facilities, and they continued her work. Vel survived until the 4th year and saw the first prototype weapon tested against a silence vessel, watched it recoil and writhe as the frequency tore through its impossible form. And he died knowing that the humans had been right. The silence could be hurt by the 5th year. The survivors had built thousands of weapons, hidden in asteroids and moons and the wreckage of destroyed ships, scattered across the galaxy in a pattern that no single attack could erase. And then they struck. The attack was coordinated across 100 light years, weapons firing simultaneously from positions the silence had never detected. The combined output generating a frequency so powerful that it could be felt across half the galaxy. The silence screamed. It was the only way to describe what happened. A sound that existed in frequencies that should not have been audible. A cry of pain and rage from entities that had not known pain for millions of years. They did not die. Nothing could kill the silence. Cetus had understood that. The humans had understood that. And the survivors understood it now, but they retreated. For the first time in recorded history, the silence withdrew from a galaxy they had been feeding on, pulling back to the dark spaces between stars to heal and recover and consider what had happened. The survivors knew they would return, perhaps in a century, perhaps in a millennium. The silence would come again, and next time they would be more careful, more thorough, more prepared. But the survivors would be ready too. In the ruins of the Conclave's capital station, a new council formed, smaller and humbler than the one that had dismissed Cetus's warnings. And they made a decision that would shape the future of the galaxy. They would not simply rebuild what had been lost. They would build something better. They established archives on 1,000 hidden worlds, filling them with everything they had learned about the silence, everything the humans had taught them, everything they had discovered in 5 years of desperate war. They included their own contributions, refinements to the Prometheus weapon, new theories about the silence's nature, strategies for survival that they had developed through bitter experience, and they addressed these archives not to themselves, but to whoever would come next, to the species that would rise after them, to the civilizations that would face the silence. When they returned, they understood now why no species had survived Earth's fall. The humans had not died because they were weak or foolish or unprepared. They had died because they chose to die, because they understood that their survival meant nothing if the knowledge died with them, because they had looked at the math and realized that the only way to win was to lose every species the silence had consumed, had added to the chain of knowledge, each one passing what they had learned to the next, building a legacy of resistance that spanned millions of years. The humans had added their piece. The Conclave had added theirs, and somewhere out there, in the dark corners of the galaxy, new species were even now taking their first steps toward the stars, unaware of the danger that waited for them, unaware of the gift that had been prepared for them by people they would never know. The survivors of the Conclave did not know if they would live to see the next battle. They did not know if their children would live to see it, or their children's children, or the countless generations that would follow, but they knew that when the silence came again, whoever faced them would not face them alone. They would carry with them the knowledge of every species that had fallen, the wisdom of every civilization that had refused to surrender, the hope of every individual who had looked into the darkness and chosen to light a torch. The humans were long dead. Their world was ash and memory, their names forgotten, their faces lost to time, but their war continued. It would continue until the silence was finally defeated, or until the last star burned out. Whichever came first, and somewhere in the archives, preserved for whoever might find it, was the final message that the humans had left for the future. The words that had sustained Daniel and Maya's people through 3,000 years of hiding. The words that now sustained the survivors of the Conclave as they prepared for the battles yet to come. The message read, "We cannot save ourselves, but we can save the ones who come after. So light the beacon and pass the fire, and let our extinction be the foundation of their victory." The survivors read those words and understood they were not the end of the story. They were just another chapter, and the story would continue until someone, someday, finally wrote the ending that the humans had dreamed of, an ending where the silence fell forever, an ending where the fire that Earth had lit burned so bright that even the darkness between stars could not extinguish it. The survivors got back too. Work there was much to do. The torch was heavy, but they would carry it as far as they could, and when they fell, someone else would pick it up. That was the gift the humans had given them. That was why Earth had died, not in defeat, but in hope.